speak at the missions things.
Really?
But not in chapel.
Yeah.
Was that mostly because of Crossroads or because of what came
Yes.
behind?
Well, it was Crossroads,
Crossroads.
and then what had happened with us in Charleston and this Houston eldership, and they had distributed that all over
Place.
the whole place.
Yeah.
I mean, I got phone calls from people I never even met,
Right.
got this package of stuff.
Amazing.
If I'd known what I know now, I'd have said, well, if I had as much money. Okay, so we got up to Pat calling you every day
and
to
so,
come.
But my husband had signed a contract to preach at this little church part-time until September, for the next year. So he went to the elders and they told him, that they wanted us to come earlier. And so what did they think? Well, they said, George, we trust your judgment. If you think you need to go now, we won't hold you to the contract. If you think that's what you need to do, it's fine with us. And so they said, if you need to go, go. We don't want you to go. We definitely need you here, but if that's what you feel like you have to do, then it's fine with us. They were very good to us. So Pat said, I want you to be here by the 1st of May. And I said, we don't have time to get everything ready at that time. We'll just leave it. So anyway, we did. We just got in the car and went up there and left everything. In fact, I haven't cleared out everything that was over yet. I haven't been back long enough to sort things out in some of the areas. But anyway, but we drove up there and found us an apartment that stayed with the Gimples again until we found an apartment in May, and 1st of May. And then we went through the, first principles class, and we had to memorize all the scriptures in NIV. We knew them all in King James. So we had a hard time trying to decide whether it was King James or NIV half the time. But anyway, I beat him by 1 point. I made a 96, he made a 95 in the test. I did that in Greek too. When we took Greek together, and I made 1 point more than he did in the Greek class.
Oh my goodness.
He didn't like
That's
that.
a good historical fact. Yeah.
Yes. So, I loved languages though, so that was easy for me. Where are we?
Moved to Boston.
We moved to Boston, yeah.
And took first principles. And
Yes,
who was discipling you?
Jim Blau. We went to Jim Blau's Bible Talk, first Bible Talk we went to, and Steve Smith and his wife had been converted 2 weeks before, so we met them at that time. And Donna Blau discipled me and Jim, my husband, for a short time, and then they started the zones, house churches first, then the zones, I guess. And Frank was leading the North Zone, and we got an apartment in Stoneham. It was really in whatever the other name was, I don't know, but the address was Stoneham. And so we led a family group there and met in Wakefield. And Frank then became my husband's discipler, and Erica discipled me right after they got married. They got married in December, and she discipled me.
And how old were they?
They were fresh out of college. Erica graduated just before she got married, and Frank graduated the June before that. So they were pretty young.
Yeah,
So-
I got to eat dinner at their apartment when they were newlyweds. It was really...
Well, they lived so very close to us. So this has nothing to do with church history, I guess, but Frank would, whenever he and Erica had a fuss, he'd run over to our apartment, to talk to us about it. So that was fun. We discipled them in their marriage.
Right.
And he loves to tell those stories.
Right. Which is a good point. It's a give and take relationship. Yeah. So how did you guys take it when they assigned this young couple to disciple you?
Well, what they were supposed to do was to teach us, what they were doing, what the discipling movement was all about. Well, we didn't know anything about it, so it was fine. And it ended up with us sort of discipling them in some other things. But anyway, we learned all about the discipling movement, and which is what we wanted to learn. And my husband went to speak at Gainesville, and then we had the next seminar. And the thing that blew his mind away too was we had the first missions contribution, and we got $1 million. And In the mainline church, to get $1 million for any contribution at all would be for a building or for a school, material things, not missions. We had a hard time. Missionaries would have to go, you remember, they'd have to go to 20 churches and get $10 from each church in order to get supported. And when they come back from the field, they had to go report to each one of them. So they didn't get a vacation at all. And, so it was very different. And we were just, he was amazed, And then, one of my classmates, Ben Holt, was the elder at Chicago, ran into him at the seminar, amazed to see him. And lots of other people that just kept coming, So Andy Fleming was one of my husband's favorite students. And, of course, he moved to Boston. And I can't remember the others, but anyway, we did fine. And then Kip decided that we needed to plant a church in Tokyo. And so he said, well, the way we need to do it is we need to take a team back and let the team get their cultural, their classes and their cultural adjustment while you go to ask the Yoyogi church if you can meet there. And then once we get the team ready, then we'll go plant a church, somewhere in Tokyo. And my husband said, I'm 70 years old, 68. He said, we'd never wanted to go back to Japan. And so he said, I don't know about that. But anyway, we prayed about it, and Kip insisted. And so Kip took him back to Tokyo in August to see whether or not they would let us come. And
that was 80.
That was 85. And they went back in August of 85 to see if it'd be okay if we came. And then Kip took another trip with Mori-san in February, I guess it was, of 86. And then, they said that we could meet with them okay. And so meanwhile, we were getting a team together. And so Randy McKean was to be the one that was to work with us, the missionary to work with us. And so we went back in, we moved, well, first of all, we couldn't get it. We had, in order to.
Steve,
right?
Can you check on the kids?
Yeah,
it's pretty loud. So Randy was going to lead the team?
Yeah, lead the team, yes. And so they wanted us to be there the first part of June, because Randy was coming in the summer for 6 weeks to get things lined up. So my granddaughter was graduating from high school at the time in Los Angeles. So my husband took Beckett and Carol Sonata with him on to Tokyo to get things arranged. And I stayed until the 21st of June, 2 weeks more, to watch my granddaughter graduate, be there for her graduation. Then I left to go. And then the McKeans came the day after I was there. But before that, we couldn't get a visa because the Yakuinkai would not write us a letter of support. You had to have a letter of support to go over there at the time, and they didn't want us to come. And we were surprised at that. Didn't know why they wouldn't want us to come, because in the meetings they, were going to let us do it, but they would not sign the paper. And so Inamata-san, on his own, said he would support us. And so then they told us we couldn't get a passport for a month. I think it was a month. But when we took Inamata-san's recommendation that he would take care of us, we got it in 2 days. That he has his biography or in Who's Who, I imagine. Anyway, they just looked him up.
He's the one that had been a judge in the high court.
Yes, yes.
And wanted George to stay the head of the board.
He's the reason why he still was. But we didn't really think that, we didn't know about the power that the head of the board had. No one had ever told us that. But, we thought, oh, well, we had representative over there. We didn't have to do anything about it. So if he wanted us to keep it, so what? We didn't care. We didn't know what it meant. So then, anyway, when we got there, our house was vacant. The fellow who had been preaching there had gone back up to Ibaraki. And the grass was tall, really tall. We couldn't even see the little Japanese house that we built between our houses. The yard, the grass was so high. Garbage was strewn all over everything. Our house was filthy. The church building wasn't kept up. And we found out that Nakanishi-san had moved his Japanese school onto the church property and used all the rooms. He'd taken all the dormitory rooms for offices except for one, and that room was where they stored everything. And they took over the kitchen and took over the auditorium for their big classes, and then used the classrooms. And the reason Nakanishi said that it was so dirty is because the people that came from these other countries weren't used to keeping things clean. We said, well, but Nakanishi, you should know that makes a bad name in the community. The neighborhood hated having that school there. And so the first thing we did was clean up the garbage, and then the next thing, my husband got up at 5 o'clock every morning, and with a scythe, we didn't have lawnmowers then, he cut down the tall grass so that we could at least see what we were doing. And there was a commode in the backyard, and there was a refrigerator that we found somebody had thrown away, was covered up by the grass. And so we paid $1,000 to have all this junk taken away. It cost $1,000 to do that. And but finally and he painted our house inside. Before I got there, he and Carol and Beckett painted and got the house all painted and cleaned the curtains. But it still wasn't really very, well, the furniture wasn't very nice. It was sad coming back to my house looking like it did. That was kind of hard on me. And I got there on Friday, and then the McKeans came on Saturday, and they were having lunch with us. We didn't have anything, dishes or anything to serve them. We got some paper plates, had sandwiches. And the same stores are still here that were there when we first started 50 years ago. Same meat market. I know all the people in the meat market. It's their son now that's taking care of it. That's fun to go back and meet them. But anyway, we got a private teacher to teach us Japanese for 6 weeks. Found an apartment for the McKeans to stay in, real small one. But it was one you could rent for a week or two at a time. And so we started with the classes first. And we met with the Yogi Church. And then we were told that we didn't have a team. They decided everybody that had been on the team was really not the person for the team. So we didn't have a team. All we had was Beckett. Carol was going back. The McKean stayed 6 weeks. And we learned that Randy McKean, he can hear this and he knows I think about it. I've already told him, but he could not understand how to learn Japanese. The teacher would say words, he couldn't even repeat them after her. He was language tone deaf. And we thought, well, what's he going to do if he comes over here and he can't learn the language? And Kate did fine, but he couldn't learn it. So we were a little bit disturbed by that. But we knew God would take care of it, and of course he did. But anyway, when they went back, there was just Beckett and George Pope and me. That was our team for the time being. And we thought, well, it's not a very big team. And of course, Frank was in Paris at the time, leading the church there. We didn't know how they were going to find us another team, though. So, first of all, what we did is we tried to find anybody who had been converted in America who had come back to Japan and see what they were doing. We found Keisei Ukai, and he'd gone to school in Illinois. He'd gone to school in Illinois, and he'd been converted in Champaign, I think. And then Rio had been converted in Indiana, and Mayumi in Texas, Dallas, Texas, and Kevin and Mariko in Gainesville, and let's see, I think that's the ones we found at the time. So we thought, well, at least we got somebody. There were 10 of us when we got through that could start. So what we did in the fall is we started meeting separately for our devos and went through the first principles class. And some of the members of the Yogi Church, like Shoda-san, they came and took the course. Shoda did really good in it. They came and took the courses with us. And then we had our own service in our house. And we had, on Sundays, we'd have dinner at our house. And so we doubled to 20 the next year, and we doubled 20 to 40 the next year. And But anyway, we went back, in Kyoko Iwanaga, she was converted in Canada, and she came home in July, and so she was one of the ones that was there too. And she had a big family. But that was it for the time being until Kenji was one of the first conversions, and Etsuko, Keisei's wife, was the first one I converted. And anyway, we did this for a while, and then we had a little seminar in January, which was just us. I forgot, maybe there were 25 people there or something. But we had I still have a tape of those lessons that the men did. And they were really good. We had a good time. But then we went back in April, because that's when I guess the break came between the mainline church and discipling movement.
This
John
is
Stevens.
87.
That was in '87 of April. John Stevens and a lot of other fellows, I've forgotten who now, came to Boston for a meeting, and Kip wanted my husband to be there to be the sort of the mediator. And so we went back in April, and it was at that time that Kip told, my husband told Kip that I had Beckett to help him. I helped me. He had no one to help him. So he said he needed a student or somebody to come and help him. So poor Steve, he got at 1 o'clock in the morning. Well, he can tell you this part.
So
Anyway.
that's when Steve comes in the picture.
Yes.
Okay, great.
He
Let's take a
needs
little
to
break,
tell that
and
part. Yeah.
we'll pull Steve in here for the rest of.
I'm Steve Schaff. I'm in San Diego, and my wife and I, we lead the West region there in San Diego with the Adames. Irene lives right down the street from us, which is amazing. God's put us back together.
Really? I didn't know that.
Yeah, over the last almost 6 years now.
6 years now, yeah.
It's amazing. So.
Okay, well, is it good? Okay. We're rolling, right? Okay, Steve, tell me about that famous phone call you got and what happened after that.
Well, it wasn't, actually it wasn't, I didn't get a phone call. It was, George was in town, George and Irene were in town. And I knew that they had been having some, George had been speaking at some of the staff meetings and so forth. Well, I was getting really close to graduating from school, and
Where were you going?
I was going to Boston University. And it was probably sometime in the beginning of maybe late April. Would that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
It was probably late April, or sometime in April.
Of 87?
Of 87. And we were over at, we had all the Bible Talk leaders over at Scott and Lynn Green's house for just a dinner. And Kip was coming just to spend some time with us, or at least that's what, we thought, in the sense of him just coming in and getting some time with the Bible Talk leaders there. And at some point during the meal, he said, "Hey, can we talk?" And Scott and myself and Kip went out on the deck, and he said, "Hey, George and Irene are in town. They need a male intern to be able to go over and work with them, and we'd like for you to go and work there in Japan." And it's at that time I realized that Kip knew that I had taken some Japanese my first 2 years of college, and I think that's kind of the connection that he made there. And but what he didn't know is that I'd taken Japanese my first year, and things went pretty well. And my last semester, I actually was studying with a Japanese guy, studying the Bible with a Japanese guy, and I prayed. I really wanted to go to Japan at that point as a sophomore in college. And I prayed, "Hey, God, if you want me to go to Japan, help this guy to become a Christian, help me get an A in Japanese." And that'll sort of be my sign, that this is a direction I should pursue. I did terrible in Japanese that semester. In fact, that was the worst course in my history of, whole academic history. And this guy didn't become a Christian, so I kind of gave it up. I thought, that's probably not God's will for me. Well, Kip knew that I'd taken Japanese. That's about all he knew about it, and he didn't know how terribly I'd done that second year. But George was in town, and just it was God's plan, I think, just to open up that door. So we had that conversation in April. I graduated in early mid-May, and I was in Japan on July 3rd. And so it's sort of a whirlwind in terms of just coming to Japan. Flew in, and took the trains and the buses to be able to get to the KO Plaza Hotel. Got into town, and there was sort of this small group waiting for me to welcome me. It was Irene and George and Beckett and probably Rio and Mayumi.
Yeah.
And so I was there just for a few minutes, and George said, well, you got about an hour to go. It was probably about 8 or 9 o'clock at that point. And he said, you got about an hour to get rested and cleaned up because we're having an all-night prayer tonight. And you're speaking at it. So it was me and George and Rio and Casey and Kevin Quist praying all night, that first night. And that just sort of set the tone for kind of expectations and the kind of experience that I would have here. But that was an incredible, incredible time. I lived right over here in one of the old dorms, and they'd sort of fixed it up for me. And there's just 100 stories in those dorms, you know, in terms of just all the history there. And one of the things that was really exciting, I really enjoyed, was that George and Irene lived in the house, obviously right here on the grounds. I lived in one of the dorms there. And just about every morning, George would come over about 5:30, 6 in the morning, and he would throw rocks at my window, and he'd wake me up, and I'd come down, and we'd have our quiet time together. And we would just, you know, we'd come down to the kitchen, and we'd probably read our Bibles for just a few minutes, and then we'd get into stories. And George would just tell stories for hours. And what time would you usually come out? About 7:30 or 8?
Yeah.
And then usually Irene would come out about 7:30, like clockwork, and make George's bacon and eggs. And at that point, I would go off and pray. But Irene wondered whether we ever had quiet times, you know, or
That's
not,
what I
because she
said.
just heard us yakking there the whole time. But that was really an amazing time for me personally, just to be able to, you know, to be there with George and Irene just for that particular year, to really be able just to hear all the stories and just to be able to sit at his feet and really learn from him and walk with him and see things from his eyes was really amazing. Really enjoyed that.
That is amazing. Did you start taking Japanese school then?
Mm-hmm.
Right
In fact, that was, I came here in July, and I think probably soon after that we went down to the Naganuma. It's called the Naganuma School of Japanese. And since the name has changed, I guess the Tokyo School of Japanese. But actually, George had gone there. Did you go there, Irene?
Mm-hmm.
George and
One
Irene.
semester.
George and Irene had gone there when they were here, you know, back 30 years before that. So we walked down there, got myself registered, and then we were off. You know, I don't exactly know when the actual semester started, but you know, it was a very intensive course. And one of my claims to fame, you know, here in the history of the Tokyo Church of Christ, I'm the only person to actually graduate from the Naganuma Nihongo Gakko. But that, you know, that year was a very intensive year of language training. George was always very serious very strict about Japanese training. In fact, I would go to school in the morning from about 9 to 12. I'd walk home, maybe about a mile away, and I'd walk home, eat lunch, study for an hour or two, and then George and Casey would come up to my room, and they would drill me for about another hour, and just work me over. And so by the time everything was done, it was about 3 in the afternoon, and that was my Japanese study time. And then from there, we'd have studies and church services and that kind of thing. And then I'd have to study some more at night and that kind of thing. But it's very intensive language training, which now I'm thankful for, obviously.
Yes.
Right.
It really stuck with me. And
It's very wise.
yeah.
So how long was it then before Frank and Erica came?
I arrived in July of '87, and if I can remember right, in the late summer of '88, there was the Far East, actually the Asian Christian, I guess it was a San Francisco conference.
Yeah.
I'm not exactly sure what we called it at that point.
I don't know. It was the first Asian conference. Didn't they call it Asian conference?
Maybe they did.
I think
when
so.
When Frank and Erica were in San Francisco.
Yeah, we went back for that.
They had been there from Paris for maybe about 6 or 8 months at that point, maybe a little bit longer. Things were really going great in San Francisco. And so we were there probably in May or June.
It was May, because it was after
88.
Anami was born.
And they ended up actually coming to Japan in August, I think, of 88, August or September. And at that point, they brought over a group with them. And in that group was Chikako, Takeshi Yamazaki, David Takahashi, and a few others that came with them, because there was actually a number of Japanese Americans that had been converted at Cal over the years, and so there's a big group from Cal of about 6 or 7
That's right.
disciples that actually came over with the camps. And so at that point, that was really exciting for me, because up to that point, really, I was just, it was basically me and George and Irene and Beckett. And obviously we had the rest of the team, but in terms of, I think it was me and another guy that were the only single men, maybe me and another 2 guys, which is always a challenge, when we counted the cost with some of the young women, because, basically we'd say, hey, you should only date Christians. So they'd look around the church and they go, well, that pretty much means you, right? Which was definitely a new definition of counting the cost. We say, well, we promise you, we're going to have more brothers in the church. And so...
Yeah, we went from 20 to 40 the year he came. We had 20 when he came, and then we went from 20 to 40.
Now, was this with the remnant of the older church, or were you meeting separately from them?
We were meeting separately.
We would have a church service in the morning on Sundays. We would have classes in the morning, and then we would have church with the group from the Yogi Hachiman Church. We would all be together. And
they planned it.
And they would plan that, and
we didn't have
there was a few different
right.
men that would come in and preach.
Right.
And now and then someone like Casey or George would do something at that service. And then we would have lunch. Everybody had a big lunch, afterward. And then we would have later on an English service. And that was...
Then we did that one.
Yeah.
That was more your group.
That was more our group.
I see.
Preach at that one.
Okay.
And go to that one, so.
Okay. And was that still continuing when Frank and Erica came with the team?
Yes.
Yeah.
That's what continued then?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and so we'd have that service in the afternoon, although I don't know if Frank really preached that very much. Because, did he? I'm not sure.
Yeah, he did some. But when Frank came, the church was still, the Yo-Yo Hachiman church still had their own leaders. The Yakuin Kai was still leading all the business. And so... We're going
to need to pull out here for...
Oh, is it stopping
We're
again?
going to need to pull out.
Yeah, too short.
You on 2?
Yeah.
Okay. I'm
Okay.
sorry. Go ahead.
So they were still taking care of the services. We had nothing to say about it. And really, even, before Frank came, and some of the fellows came, didn't they come in January, I think, or else Frank went back home. But, the team was here before Frank came.
I think probably over that period of maybe 2 months, that group came.
Right.
Came somewhere in there, yeah.
Right.
But anyway, the funniest thing was that they'd all fall asleep during the Japanese services.
Yeah, the Japanese service were very quiet.
Quiet, and dumb. They didn't know what they were saying. And
Yeah,
so
we didn't know what they were saying.
I took some pictures from behind one time, and everybody's heads
Oh, my.
Well,
I teased them.
the funny thing was, too, is that sort of traditionally, in Japanese culture, you showed respect for the speaker by,
Yes.
Closing your eyes
and listening.
and kind of
quietly.
putting your head down and concentrating was sort of the thing that they were saying. Now, so half the time you couldn't tell whether that was actually happening or it was more an excuse just to to sleep during church. So
Yeah, that's rough for Americans. That's a tough way to show respect.
yeah.
So how did... The revival is marked as 1989.
Yes.
Right.
So tell us about that. How did that actually... What does that mean, the revival?
Sorry, thank you.